We continue our discussion of the LA Kings' busy offseason with LA Kings Insider Zach Dooley on this edition of Locked On LA Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Kings fans, welcome to Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On LA Kings your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Please like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content. I'm Eddie Garcia, your host of Locked On LA Kings. I've worked in sports media for the past 30 years, 20 plus years at the Fox Sports Radio Network. I'm also co-host of the Puck Podcast, a weekly NHL review show that's been putting out content for the last 17 years, and a passionate LA Kings fan for the past 30 years. This episode brought to you by Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter promo code LockedOnNHL for a free white tech hat with your order. You won't want to take off your Birddogs, we promise. We are happy to welcome back to the show Zach Dooley, the LA Kings insider. You can follow him on Twitter or X or whatever they're calling it these days at Dooley, LAK, DOLLEY. And you can also check out his fine work at LAKingsInsider.com. Hey, Zach, how are you?
Eddie, I'm doing great. How are you? Thanks for having me back on.
I'm doing great. Good to have you back on. And I didn't realize it had been so long since we last spoke. I went back and checked out the last episode that you had joined us, and the Stanley Cup hadn't been awarded yet. We talked about the LA Kings season and you know what we thought of it. I think we both agreed that there was progress made, that it was a better season than the year before. Of course, it obviously had the same result, losing in the first round of the playoffs. And the big talk was how this offseason would go, what the challenge would be for GM Rob Blake. By my count, we had 3 trades, 16 unrestricted or restricted free agents signed, and a couple of contract extensions. But before we get into the specific moves, were you surprised the Kings did more than just tweak the roster for this coming season?
I wouldn't say surprised. I thought the messaging straight from exit interviews was improve the team. That could go a lot of different ways, right? It could be external improvements or internal improvements. You could bank on players who are younger, who have higher ceilings, improving to a point of where your existing roster gets to that point without those external moves, or you can make a move like the Kings did. It drastically changes the makeup of the team and the approach of the team to a different look. But overall, no, I wouldn't say that I was surprised to see it happen. You never always see it coming, but the fact that they were so willing to make a big move, I wouldn't say it was like out of left field or anything like that for me.
Well, the biggest trade obviously was acquiring center Pierre-Luc Dubois from the Winnipeg Jets. Out go Gabe Vilardi, Alex Iafallo, Rasmus Kupari, and a second-round pick. And then they signed Dubois to the 8-year extension. And when I looked at the Kings' priorities in the offseason, getting a number 2 center wasn't on my list. When do you think and why do you think the Kings decided that getting a Pierre-Luc Dubois was something they needed to do?
I think the biggest reason is that centers of his age and his ability don't come around as being available very often. So when one did, the priorities changed to acquire that player. Like you don't see a 25-year-old center who is a 60-point guy, a physical guy, someone in that top 6 role become available to you every year, right? Like that player isn't available every offseason, especially at the center position. So the second that player did become available, I think it certainly spurred a little bit of action. I don't know if the Kings maybe went in with that priority because they didn't know that player would be available to them. So when that player became available, when it became clear that he would commit to the franchise long term, I think that's when the Kings decided this is the guy that we want to get. This is the route that we want to go. And when you go after a player of that caliber, you have to give to get, no doubt about it. And the give in this instance came in the form of 3 very solid roster players.
The Kings also had a 3-team deal with Philadelphia and Columbus. They shipped out goalie Cal Peterson, defenseman Sean Walker, prospect Helge Granz, and a second-round pick. That helped them to free up the cap space to re-sign defenseman Vladislav Gavrikov, something that I wasn't all that optimistic they would be able to do. Your thoughts on that move, and how much do you think a full season of Gavrikov really helps out the defensive core?
I mean, I think it's huge. There was kind of this running narrative that Vladislav Gavrikov would test free agency, though he never actually said that. People just kind of ran with it. It was in the same boat as the Pierre-Luc Dubois would only sign in Montreal rumor, right? These were widely accepted things that the player never actually said, and both turned out to be untrue. The cap space for Gavrikov was always the hardest part, right? You had to clear out room to be able to bring him and make this impactful move for a guy like Dubois. It came in the form of needing to clear space in net. Cal Peterson's deal was the one that needed to go. Kings were able to move it at a bit of a negative value, but the assets given weren't all that great to where you couldn't stomach the deal. Getting Gavrikov is huge. With Gavrikov in the lineup last year, alongside Doughty, Roy, and Anderson, the Kings went 11, 1, and 2. So it's pretty clear that when he was in the lineup during the regular season, the Kings were a really good team. So very excited to be able to get him back. And I think a 2-year term is perfect for both sides.
The Kings also dealt defenseman Sean Durzi for a second-round pick. And all due respect to Durzi, the Kings have two very young, exciting offensive defensemen waiting in the wings in Brandt Clarke and Jordan Spence. I know a lot of people, including me, are very excited to see more of Brandt Clarke after we got that little taste of him last season. Do you think there's a sense in the organization that he is ready to take on a more significant role at the NHL level sooner rather than later?
That's certainly the hope, right? You have a guy who's a first-round pick. He was pretty impressive in his little stint with the Kings last year, those first 9 games, had a dominant year in the OHL, and now there's a spot for him. Last year, there wasn't necessarily a spot for him because the Kings had so many right shot D. Now they don't. Like they have Doughty and they have Roy, but Sean Durzi's in Arizona, Sean Walker's in Philadelphia, and all of a sudden there's a spot to be won on that third pair, and you have two very exciting prospects, Brandt Clarke and Jordan Spence, one of whom will lock down that spot. There's no doubt about it. I think there's obviously more hype around Clarke, right? He's the first-round pick. He was a top 10 selection. We've seen the staggering totals that he posted in junior. But Jordan Spence is an excellent player as well. They're different. Spence is a little bit more mobile. Clarke maybe a little bit trickier and more crafty with the puck. But both guys have that offensive defenseman profile. I think both guys are capable coming into the season of locking down and playing that RD3 role. It'll be a really exciting battle, in my opinion, to watch during camp. And it should be exciting, right? Because those guys play a style of hockey that is exciting to watch. And fills the void left by guys like Durzi and Walker, who had those offensive attributes.
There seems to be a bit of a prevailing theory that the Kings got better offensively, maybe got a little bit less good defensively, and that their depth has been hurt because of the number of bodies that they had to ship out. Would you agree with that kind of overall general assessment?
I think they definitely are more stacked at the top, right? Like if you look at the way the Kings are built now, it's 2 pairings defensively that are going to be the Kings hope to be very, very good, right? Anderson, Doughty, Gavrikov, Roy. If you look at each of their individual metrics, those 2 pairings on the top 4 on the back end were extremely good down the stretch last year, and will probably shoulder more of the load, taking less off of a third pair that will likely have a rookie on the right side. And if you look up front, the Kings' depth was kind of one of the strengths last year, but now it's going to be a little bit different with how they can allot the minutes because they have a 1-2-3 punch down the middle, Kopitar, Dubois, Deneau, that you'd probably take against just about every team in the league, right? Like that's a pretty tough 1-2-3 punch to match up against with a guy in Blake Lizotte who becomes a very, very good 4th line center. The Kings have fewer options because they traded 3 forwards out for 1 coming in, but it opens up opportunities for other guys. Now you have Arthur Kaliev, who is a healthy scratch at times during the playoffs. He has a spot to win on the 3rd line or the 2nd line. He can play higher in the lineup where his skill set matters. Quentin Byfield has to take a step forward. He's going to be expected to play likely on the 1st line to start the year. And then you'll have other younger players like your Anderson Dolans, your Grundstroms, your Fagimos who could come into training camp and potentially win a spot there. So it's certainly a differently made up Kings team. I think it's more based around that top 3 centers, top 2 defensive pairs than it was the full group. So I think that point is probably right. But it's just going to be a little bit differently structured of a Kings team.
Well, there are certainly varying opinions from Kings fans, as you would expect when you have a big deal like this. Some people like the Pierre-Luc Dubois deal, some people don't. Obviously, there was a certain segment of the fan base that was unhappy with the Jonathan Quick move, but I think you can say pretty definitively Rob Blake as a GM is not afraid to make unpopular moves that can help the franchise, or maybe, I don't know if controversial, but bold moves to kind of help the franchise. He's kind of proven himself by these moves that he's made in the past 6 months or so.
Certainly not afraid to take the swing, right? You have to make those moves eventually to get to that point. And I think it is always hard to see players who you've seen for several years, who you've seen like an Iafallo go from an undrafted free agent to a top 9 forward, or from a Velarde who had all those struggles right after he was drafted with back injuries to become finally that player who broke out at the NHL level. But you have to give up to get a player like Pierre-Luc Dubois. And Dubois is different. He is more physical. He's a bigger center down the middle, and he's not afraid to play the body. And there are very few players in the NHL who have that combination. If you look at points and penalty minutes, I know penalty minutes can be a tricky stat, but he's in the company of guys like Matthew Tkachuk, Brady Tkachuk, Brad Marchand, of the combination of points and PIMs. And you win with players like that who can match up physically. And if you look at the teams that the Kings will have to match up against down the middle, you need those types of players to match up against those bigger physical centers that the Kings will face in the Pacific Division. So I think it's a move that, yeah, there's always going to be positives and negatives to it. People are going to like it. Some people aren't going to like it. The proof will be in the pudding ultimately. Does this move make the Kings a better team? I think in the interim, to me, it undoubtedly does make the Kings a better team. Over the course of the 8 years, it'll have to play out on the ice.
Coming up, more with Zach Dooley, the LA Kings insider, here on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. But first, I need to let you know about Birddogs. This episode brought to you by Birddogs. And what are Birddogs, you ask? Well, they are shorts with the underwear built in them. I know you may ask yourself, why would I want to wear that? Well, the answer is because they are super comfortable and look great. Honestly, how often does something that looks good also feels good? It is the perfect combination. Not only do Birddogs look good and feel good, but you can wear them pretty much in any situation. You can wear them out to a nice casual dinner. You can even work out in them because they're so comfortable. And once you try them, you'll wonder why you had never heard of them before. So go to birddogs.com/lockedonnhl or enter the promo code lockedonnhl for a free white tech hat with your order. That's birddogs.com, birddogs.com/lockedonnhl network, or enter the promo code lockedonnhl for a free white tech hat. You won't want to take your Birddogs off, I promise you. All right, we've got more with LA Kings insider Zach Dooley. Follow him on Twitter at DooleyLAK. The Kings also, Zach, give Anze Kopitar a 2-year contract extension, kicks in after this coming season. Now he's about to turn 36, but led the Kings in scoring again this past season. He's approaching some big milestones this coming season as well. Going to be the Kings' all-time leader in games played early in the season, barring anything unforeseen. We did see the retirement of Patrice Bergeron recently, and I think as a Kings fan, it was kind of easy to relate to what Bruins fans were going through with the loss of a player like that, who's such an iconic player, has won a championship, has been such a great representative of your organization on and off the ice. But for Kopi, he's not ready to go there yet. He's a future Hall of Famer, but just talk about what a huge part of the Kings Anze Kopitar still is right now.
I mean, absolutely integral, right? This is still your 1C. He led the team in scoring last year, was in the top 5 in the Selke, won the Lady Byng. Like this is the leader of this team on and off the ice. Like he means that much. And I think it means something to Kopitar to be, a one franchise guy, which is what he's been to this point in his career. He made it very clear that he wanted to sign the extension this summer. Rob Blake made it very clear he wanted to sign Kopitar to the extension this summer. And it comes in at a pretty fair hit. Obviously, an older player, the commitment is not overly long. And the cap hit is a small reduction from where he will be at this year. So it gives the team a little bit more flexibility going into this coming offseason. So I think it's a win-win across the board. You see a longtime competitor and Selke nemesis in Bergeron hang him up. Outstanding career for Patrice Bergeron, no doubt about it. And Kopitar had a very classy statement about that. But for Kings fans, it's exciting that they won't have that separation for the next 3 years because Kopitar wants to keep playing, and he's been playing at such a high level that right now there's no reason at all to expect any kind of a drop-off in his play.
One of the biggest things I think every Kings fan looked at as a priority this offseason was the situation in net. I think the Kings are definitely upgraded in more ways than one. They're not paying over $10 million for their goalies, which they were at this time last year, now just over $2 million. But they re-signed Phoenix Copley. They bring in Cam Talbot. They've also brought in David Rittich as some depth in the organization as well. How do you feel about the Kings goaltending situation heading into the season?
Look, I mean, you hit the nail on the head to start it, right? Last year, it was one of the heftiest commitments towards the salary cap. And this year, I believe the Kings are the lowest spending team in net. Last year, from opening night through the trade deadline, I believe the Kings ranked 31st in the NHL in total team save percentage. And that's not an embodiment of one goaltender or even the goaltenders at all. It could be the team around them as well. But the fact of the matter was, the Kings were right in the playoff mix, ranking 31st in save percentage. After the deadline, you know what the record was. It was excellent, and the save percentage was towards the top of the league. So if you can even meet in the middle, and it's just league average, right? That's an improvement overall from where the Kings were at last year. And Cam Talbot's a veteran. He's won a lot of games. He's played in the playoffs. He's familiar with Todd McClellan and Trent Yawney and the system that the Kings are going to run. And for $1 million against the cap, I don't know if you could get a better fit than Cam Talbot. Like, you don't get too many guys at that level, at that cap hit. So it feels like a good signing for the Kings. He won't be expected to play 60 games because Copley was so strong last year that the expectation is kind of a tandem split to start the year, riding the hot hand as it makes sense. And you have to feel, I think, fairly confident in that group, even if there are some question marks around it, namely, Copley's inexperience and Talbot's age. But when you look at the situation that the Kings are in, if you commit to a guy like Dubois, you have to find some savings in other areas in order to round out the roster. And that just happens to be in net. I think that the system that the Kings play, this tandem, in my opinion, is good enough to get them to where they need to be.
So the Kings seem pretty much set as far as their roster. I can't imagine they're going to go out and try and add anyone at this point. But obviously the lineup isn't set. We think probably the top three lines, pretty much we know what's going to happen there. And the top two pairings, I think, are certainly kind of set in stone. But would you agree, as far as like camp battles, that the wing positions on the fourth line and the third pairing are where we're going to see some decisions have to be made and some guys maybe winning some jobs in camp?
Yeah, I think for sure. You have a lot of options. And one interesting thing to look out for this year is that because of cap constraints, the Kings won't likely carry 23 players on their roster, meaning 3 healthy scratches. They'll likely only be able to carry 1 or 2 scratched players on a given night to be cap compliant, which actually puts a little bit more interest around those battles, right? Because there are fewer spots to be won, meaning fewer guys will be able to be on the opening night roster. I think starting on the back end, third pairing for sure, you have a lot of options. The right side, it's likely Brandt Clark and Jordan Spence, who are the guys to look for. But on the left side, first off, you have those 2 guys, maybe one of whom could play the left, but you also have Andreas Englund, who signed from the Colorado Avalanche. You have Tobias Bjornfoot, a former first-round pick here. You have a guy like Jacob Moverara, who the organization kind of knows what he is. You have Kevin Connaughton acquired from the Flyers. You have a lot of guys who have played NHL games who could slot in on that left side, but there's likely only room for 1 or maybe 2 of those guys on the roster. That's going to be a really interesting battle to watch, in my opinion, during camp. And then on the fourth line, you have Blake Lizotte, who is an outstanding fourth-line center. You have Carl Grundstrom, who's a bit more established. And you have Trevor Lewis, who's a veteran Kings fans I think are very familiar with, a PK guy and a very solid fourth liner. Then you have Jared Anderson-Dolan. You have Samuel Fagemo. Can a guy like Alex Laferriere make the jump? Can a guy like Alex Turcotte make the jump? You have Mikhail Maltsev, who was signed in the offseason. All of these guys should feel like they have legitimate aspirations of making that opening night roster, but several of them can't due to roster limits and salary cap limits. So I think those are for sure the spots that are most likely to be watched. And I think that's really where those battles are going to be the most exciting.
And I think it's pretty clear that Quentin Byfield and Arthur Kaliev are certainly going to be on the roster. But I would say that there are 2 players I'm looking at that need to take a step forward, that are getting an opportunity to have a bigger role. Obviously, with the loss of Gabe Vilardi and Alex Iafallo, there are some shoes that need to be filled there. Would you agree with those 2 players, or maybe a Trevor Moore as well, that the Kings need to have a little bit more from this coming season because of of the roster and the lack of depth that was there before.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think starting with the guy you mentioned last, and Trevor Moore, I mean, a lot of his struggles last year came due to injury. It wasn't really his play, but he had a tough injury that was challenging to get back from, not only to get back in the lineup, but to get back to form. It took him some time to get there. I thought we saw in the playoffs the kind of player that we know Trevor Moore can be. And with a full bill of health, I think we'll see more of that guy we saw during the 21-22 season when he really broke out as that exciting, energetic player. Byfield and Kaliyev, no doubt about it, right? Those guys are going to likely be expected to fill top 9 roles, and they have to match that top 9 role with the production that comes along with those positions. Byfield gets a lot of flack, right? Because of his draft stock and because of his goal total last year, but he was a second on the Kings in assists per 60 behind Kevin Fiala. So he's a guy, he was producing offensively, just not in terms of goals. Obviously, you don't want to see your first line left winger with 3 goals. He's going to want to up that total. The Kings will expect a higher total there, but he did a lot of things that made Kopitar and Kempe more successful. That line, their production as a whole is good. So if Byfield can take that next step personally, it's only going to make that line and the team that much better. And for Kaliyev, he was kind of the victim of Gabe Vilardi's outburst during camp last year, got cycled down to the 4th line, never had that long extended look in the top 9, and then he got hurt. I think it was late December, and that kind of halted his progress. So it's a big opportunity for both those guys. For Kaliyev, you wonder, like, if he can play on a second or third line for a long run with his shot and his offensive instincts, like, he could be a guy who fills some of those goal totals that have been vacated by other guys because he has that in his game. So I think those are definitely the names that you want to look for. And those are the guys the Kings will be counting on to take those steps forward.
A little bit more with Zach Dooley, the LA Kings insider, here on Locked on LA Kings, your team every day. This episode of Locked on LA Kings also brought to you by AG1. With one delicious scoop of AG1, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food-sourced superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. The special blend of ingredients supports your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, recovery, focus, and aging. AG1 contains less than 1 gram of sugar, costs you less than $3 a day, and it's just 1 scoop in a cup of water. That's it. No need for a million different pills or supplements to look out for your health. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, then try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/NHL network. That's drinkag1.com/NHL network. Check it out. All right, we are wrapping it up with the LA Kings insider, Zach Dooley. Check out his work at lakingsinsider.com. We've been talking a lot about things that have gone on since the last time we spoke. And since the last time we spoke, there was also a shakeup with the Kings broadcasting crew. And we know there are going to be changes with the local TV coverage because of the turbulent situation going on with the regional sports networks. Is there any news on that at all, as far as what Kings fans can expect as far as where they can watch their games? And if there's not any news on that, is there any sense on when an announcement on that might be coming forward?
I wouldn't say there's any updates on that at this time, but as far as timeline, it's not that long, right? Until, preseason games are in 6 weeks. So you have to imagine that there will be something coming in the foreseeable future, just because the schedule dictates it, right? It's got to come out soon, which direction exactly the Kings go. I don't really have an inkling on exactly what that'll be right now. There'll be a simulcasted approach with Nick, Jim, and Daryl calling on TV. That'll be simulcast, the play-by-play, at least on the radio. So I'm certainly looking forward to seeing exactly, what the output is and how things will look like. And with the season a lot closer than it kind of feels like, imagine we'll see something on that front pretty soon.
Well, we've got rookie camp coming up, rookie face-off in Las Vegas, training camp, preseason, all leading up, of course, to the regular season. We know you're going to be covering all that and more at lakingsinsider.com. Anything else you got coming up to let the listeners or the viewers know about?
We got the one wrinkle this year is the Australia trip, which is going to be awesome. Trying to figure out coverage across 17 hours of time difference is going to be really, really interesting. But that's going to be a once in a lifetime kind of opportunity and experience for the Kings. That'll be really cool to get over there and kind of open camp in a completely different place. It's going to be strange for sure. It's going to be different. But I think that's going to be really exciting. And, it's going to be fast once we get going. Cause like you said, there's the rookie tournament, there's the Australia games, and then there's a very heavy preseason schedule when we get back. And then it's right into things with the regular season. So very excited to get going. But that Australia content, I think, is going to be really cool. And at the very least, it's going to be unique and something that this team probably may not have the opportunity to ever do again. So I think we're all looking forward to that.
And Jordan Spence has got to be a big part of that, right? Being the only Australian-born NHL player. I know he didn't grow up in Australia, but that's certainly something that I'm sure the local media there is going to really want to talk to him about and his experience and things like that.
I would imagine so, right? I mean, it's really cool. I know he's probably identifies a little bit more with his Japanese heritage, his Canadian heritage, but still to have a player in the organization who was born in Australia is still very special, especially, he's going to be a guy that will have some eyes on him during camp as he tries to win a full-time job out of training camp for the first time. So I think you're right. I'm sure he'll have plenty of coverage coming his way when things get going, but it's a really cool wrinkle, really cool story to kind of have as the Kings go over there.
And I'm sure you will have an interesting story on that wrinkle as well at LA Kings Insider. He is the LA Kings Insider, Zach Dooley. Zach, I always appreciate your time. I know you kind of made some special accommodations for me today, which I personally appreciate. Always great to have you on. Love your content. Looking forward to seeing what's coming up on lakingsinsider.com, and we'll follow you on Twitter as well. But always thanks for your time and your information. Really appreciate it.
No problem, man. Anytime.
All right. We appreciate Zach Dooley and look forward to having him back on the show, maybe right before the season starts or right after the season starts, but we'll definitely get him back on again. And you guys have to follow him on Twitter, follow his work. He does a great job following the LA Kings as the LA Kings Insider. All right, for all you everydayers, those of you that listen and watch every day or right now during this period every other day, coming up on Friday, we have our weekly LA Kings fan feedback show. All your questions, all your comments, anything going on with the LA Kings, anything we talked about with Zach Dooley, certainly on the table. If you want to send an email, the email address is lockedoneddie@gmail.com, EDDIE, lockedoneddie@gmail.com. And as always, you can leave your comments on the YouTube episodes as well. And we'd love for you to stay a part of the show by following us on Twitter and Instagram. We are at Locked On LA Kings. I'm Eddie Garcia. Thank you as always for listening and watching this episode of Locked On LA Kings, part of Locked On Podcast Network. Have a great day. We'll talk to you on Friday. And as always, go Kings go.